The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden glow over the worn oak table, where I sat with my cup of coffee. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the mug, the familiar ache in my joints reminding me of my age. 68 years. Sometimes I felt every single one of them etched into my bones like rings in an old tree. Today was supposed to be a joyful day, and it was. At least I kept telling myself that. My grandson, Ethan, was graduating from college. My Ethan. The boy I'd held in my arms on the night his mother, my daughter Grace, left this world far too soon. The boy I raised when no one else seemed willing to step up. I should have felt nothing but pride, and in a way, I did. But beneath the pride ran a deep current of something else. Bitterness, maybe, or perhaps just weariness. Everyone in town knew Ethan's story, or at least they thought they did. They saw the picture-perfect narrative, a hard-working young man with a devoted father who sacrificed everything to see his son succeed. That devoted father was Daniel, my late daughter's husband, Ethan's father. If only they knew the truth. Daniel had been present in the most superficial ways, popping in for the occasional soccer game or holiday photo, but he'd been absent where it truly mattered. It was me who had worked late nights at the diner, me who had scraped together money for Ethan's school supplies, me who had sat up with him when he cried over a bad grade or a broken heart. But Daniel had the charm, the polished smile, the easy way of taking credit for things he hadn't done. And people believed him because that was the story they wanted to hear. I glanced at the clock. It was time to get ready. 2 hours later, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, smoothing down the skirt of my navy blue dress. I hadn't bought anything new for today. I couldn't afford to, but I'd done my best to make myself presentable. I fastened the small silver locket around my neck, the one that had belonged to Grace. Inside was a tiny picture of her holding a newborn Ethan. My fingers lingered on it for a moment, a silent prayer passing through my heart. Grace, if only you could see him today. By the time I arrived at the college, the parking lot was already packed. Families bustled around, laughing and taking photos, balloons bobbing in the warm breeze. I spotted Daniel right away. He stood near the entrance in a perfectly tailored suit, surrounded by a small group of relatives and friends. His booming laugh carried over the crowd as he regaled them with some exaggerated story about how he'd supported Ethan through the tough times. My stomach tightened. I forced a polite smile as I approached, though he barely glanced at me. "Margaret," he said with a curt nod, as if my presence was little more than an obligation. "Daniel," I replied, my voice calm, measured. I'd learned long ago that showing my true feelings only gave him more power. As we filed into the auditorium, the energy was electric. Proud parents clutched bouquets and cameras, while graduates in crisp caps and gowns adjusted their tassels nervously. I found my seat in the front row, heart swelling as I caught sight of Ethan among the sea of students. He stood tall and confident, his smile wide and genuine. In that moment, my heart nearly burst with love. The ceremony began, the dean delivering a speech about resilience and perseverance. Applause roared through the hall. Daniel puffed up beside me like a peacock, soaking in every bit of praise directed his way. I stayed quiet, hands folded in my lap, the cool metal of Grace's locket pressing into my palm. This was Ethan's day. My job was to be here, to bear witness. Even if no one else knew the truth, I knew, and for now, that would have to be enough. The dean's words seemed to fade into the background as the audience erupted in polite applause. My focus was fixed on Ethan, standing among the other graduates. His cap sat slightly askew, just as it had the day he'd graduated from high school. My heart swelled with pride, but it was tinged with a familiar ache, a bittersweet mixture of joy and resentment. Beside me, Daniel leaned forward, elbows propped arrogantly on his knees. He grinned broadly, nodding as if every kind word spoken about this graduating class had been meant for him personally. Couldn't have done it without him, I heard one of his cousins whisper behind us. Daniel worked himself to the bone for that boy. Another added. My jaw tightened, and I kept my eyes straight ahead. I'd become an expert at hiding my emotions over the years. If they saw me flinch, they'd ask questions I didn't want to answer. The truth was simpler, though far less flattering. When Grace passed, Ethan was just 9 years old, a fragile, grieving little boy who'd lost his mother far too soon. Daniel had been physically present at the funeral, but emotionally gone. Within weeks, he'd buried himself in work and eventually in other relationships. It was me who had packed Ethan's lunches and ironed his school uniforms. Me who had learned how to fix a broken radiator at 3 a.m. so he wouldn't be cold in the winter. Me who had cheered from the sidelines at every soccer game, even when the other parents wondered why Grandma was always there instead of Dad. But those memories weren't public knowledge. They were mine, alone. The dean continued speaking, sharing statistics about the graduating class, their achievements, the challenges they had overcome. Words like perseverance and sacrifice echoed through the auditorium, cutting me deeper than I expected. Daniel shifted in his seat, straightening his tie like a man preparing to receive an award. When the dean mentioned the scholarships many students had earned, Daniel gave a loud, satisfied sigh, glancing around to see who might be watching him. He's been through so much, Daniel said to the woman sitting next to him, his tone dripping with false modesty. But I always told him no matter what, I'd make sure he had everything he needed to succeed. The woman nodded sympathetically. You must be so proud. It takes a strong father to raise a boy like that. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Strong father. The words rang hollow, almost laughable, if they hadn't hurt so much. Daniel had been absent for so many of the milestones that mattered. Ethan's first middle school dance, his first heartbreak, the night he got accepted into college and jumped around the living room, hugging me so tightly I couldn't breathe. Daniel hadn't been there for any of it. As the dean wrapped up his speech, I let my mind wander back to those early years. I could still picture Ethan at the kitchen table, his little legs swinging under the chair as he struggled with his math homework. I'd sit beside him for hours whispering encouragement, even when my own body ached from working double shifts at the diner. I remembered the time he came home from school with a tear in his shirt and a bruise on his cheek. Some older boys had made fun of him for not having the latest sneakers. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up late stitching his shirt back together, tears streaming down my face as I counted my tips and realized I didn't have enough to buy him a new pair of shoes. The next morning, I told him the bruise would fade, but his worth never would. Those were the sacrifices no one ever saw. The sound of my name snapped me back to the present. Daniel was waving me over as relatives gathered around him like moths to a flame. Margaret, he said loudly, clapping me on the back. Tell them how hard it was to get Ethan through school. I worked day and night, didn't I? He grinned, waiting for me to back up his lie. I forced a thin smile and nodded, my voice even. Yes, Daniel, you certainly worked hard. They all laughed and patted him on the back, none the wiser. Inside, my chest burned. The truth sat like a stone in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time to expose him, not on Ethan's special day. Still, as the ceremony moved forward, one thought kept circling my mind like a persistent whisper. One day, the truth will come out. One day, someone will see me. The graduates began lining up, the sound of their polished shoes tapping against the stage, echoing through the auditorium. My breath caught when I spotted Ethan near the front of the line. He looked so tall, so sure of himself, standing there in his crisp black gown and neatly pressed cap. The tassel hung to the right, swaying slightly as he laughed at something one of his classmates said. In that moment, he wasn't the little boy who used to cling to my skirt or fall asleep with his head on my lap. He was a man, ready to step into the world. My heart swelled with a pride so fierce it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I clutched the silver locket at my neck, the one with Grace's picture inside, and whispered under my breath, "You'd be so proud of him, baby girl. We did it. We got him here." The dean's voice boomed across the hall as names were read aloud. Each student walked across the stage, shaking hands, their families erupting into cheers. Around me, proud parents clapped and shouted their children's names. When Ethan's name was called, Ethan James Carter, I stood up before I realized what I was doing, my hands clasped tightly together. "That's my boy," Daniel bellowed beside me, his voice loud enough to startle those in the rows ahead. Cameras flashed as he waved like a conquering hero, drawing attention to himself. But I couldn't take my eyes off Ethan. He walked across that stage with his head held high, every step radiating confidence. I saw glimpses of his entire childhood in that moment, the scraped knees, the late-night homework sessions, the small victories and crushing disappointments. All of it had led to this. When he reached the dean, they shook hands. The dean handed him the diploma with a proud smile, then leaned slightly toward Ethan, whispering something in his ear that made my grandson's face light up. Ethan nodded, then glanced toward me, his eyes shimmering with something I couldn't quite read. My chest tightened. As the applause swelled and Ethan moved to the other side of the stage, the dean didn't return to his podium. Instead, he stepped down a few stairs and approached the front row. Approached me. Confused, I straightened in my seat. The dean bent slightly, his voice low so only I could hear. "Actually, Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "your grandson's essay about you is why he got the scholarship." For a moment, I couldn't process the words. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, leaving only the pounding of my heart in my ears. My essay?" I stammered, hardly able to breathe. He nodded, his expression kind. "Yes. The scholarship committee was deeply moved by it. He wrote about your sacrifices, the way you raised him after his mother passed. It was one of the most powerful pieces we've ever read." Then with a soft pat on my hand, he returned to the stage as if he'd merely commented on the weather. But his words reverberated through me, breaking something loose inside. I sat frozen in my seat, my vision blurring with tears. My hands shook so violently I had to grip the edge of my chair to keep steady. Ethan had seen me. All these years, I'd thought my sacrifices went unnoticed, that I was the invisible figure in the background while Daniel soaked up the praise. I'd convinced myself Ethan didn't fully understand what I'd given up for him, but he had known. He had always known. The realization was almost too much to bear. My throat tightened, a sob threatening to escape, but I bit it back. This was Ethan's moment, and I wouldn't ruin it with a public display. Still, I couldn't stop the tears that slipped down my cheeks, quiet and unchecked. As Ethan took his seat with the other graduates, he looked out into the crowd and found me. Our eyes met across the distance, and in his gaze I saw it all: love, gratitude, and an unspoken acknowledgement that needed no words. I pressed my hand to my heart, nodding slightly. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly, deeply seen. The crowd erupted into cheers again as the dean announced the conclusion of the ceremony. Daniel clapped loudly, already turning to those around him to soak in their praise. But I barely heard him, because for me, everything had shifted. The balance of truth and lies had tilted, and I knew now that no matter what Daniel said, no matter what the world believed, Ethan and I shared something far more powerful than public recognition: the truth of our bond. And that truth was finally enough. The applause faded into the background as I sat there, stunned, the dean's words still echoing in my mind. "Your grandson's essay about you is why he got the scholarship." Even now, it didn't feel real. It was as if the past 20 years, the grief, the sleepless nights, the endless sacrifices, had been wrapped into that single sentence, finally acknowledged after all this time. As Ethan smiled for photos on stage, memories began to surface like old film reels in my mind. The first reel was of a cold January night, the night Grace died. I could still hear the phone ringing, the urgent voice on the other end telling me there had been an accident. Grace was gone before I even made it to the hospital. The details after that were a blur of paperwork, funeral arrangements, and tears I didn't have time to shed. Ethan had been only 9 years old, sitting on the edge of his bed that night with his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His eyes were swollen from crying, his little face blotchy and pale. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice breaking, "is Mommy really gone?" I gathered him into my arms and rocked him back and forth like I used to when he was a baby. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm here. I'll always be here." That was the night I made a silent vow. Ethan would never feel abandoned, no matter what it cost me. The next memory was of a tiny kitchen table, barely big enough for 2 plates and a stack of unpaid bills. Daniel had stopped by briefly one evening, dropping off Ethan after a weekend visit. I'd asked him about helping with school expenses, but he'd brushed me off with vague promises about money being tight. After he left, I counted out the crumpled bills and coins I'd made at the diner that week. It wasn't enough, not for the rent, not for groceries, and certainly not for Ethan's new science project kit that he'd been so excited about. That night, I opened my jewelry box and stared at my wedding ring. It wasn't worth much, but it was all I had left of my late husband. My hands shook as I took it to the pawn shop the next day. When Ethan came home from school and saw the shiny new kit on the table, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Grandma, you got it!" he exclaimed, throwing his arms around me. I hugged him back, forcing a smile while silently mourning the ring I'd never see again. There were smaller sacrifices, too, the ones no one ever noticed. Like the Christmas mornings when I wrapped secondhand toys to make sure Ethan never felt like he was missing out. The nights I came home so tired my feet throbbed, but I still stayed up to quiz him on spelling words because he had a test the next day. The times I went without new clothes or doctor's visits so I could pay for his private school tuition. Ethan was a bright boy, and I knew he needed opportunities this small town couldn't always provide. Every choice I made, every penny I spent was for him. Then came the teenage years, and with them, new challenges. Ethan grew taller and more independent, but also more aware of the gaps in his life. Gaps where a father should have been. One night, he came home from school looking defeated. "Some kids were talking today," he said quietly. "They asked why Dad never comes to my games." I froze, unsure how to answer. Finally, I cupped his face in my hands. "You have me, Ethan. That's what matters. And I promise you, I will never miss a single game." And I didn't. Rain or shine, whether I was sick or exhausted, I was there. I became his biggest fan, his loudest cheerleader, his constant. As these memories cascaded through my mind, I realized something profound. Ethan's essay wasn't just words on paper. It was a mirror reflecting the truth of our lives. The countless moments we'd shared, the love that had quietly bound us together when everything else fell apart. For years, I'd believed my efforts were invisible, swallowed by the shadows of Daniel's lies and the world's ignorance. But Ethan had been watching all along. The ceremony ended with a swell of music, jolting me back to the present. Families surged toward the stage, eager to hug their graduates. I stood slowly, wiping the tears from my cheeks. My legs felt heavy, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. I didn't know what Ethan had written exactly, but I didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. No matter what Daniel claimed, no matter who believed him, Ethan and I shared something unbreakable, the truth of our journey. And that truth, finally, was shining through. The reception hall was buzzing with celebration, a sea of proud families packed tightly around tables, draped in white linen and gold centerpieces. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the cheerful chatter of graduates posing for photos with their families. I lingered near the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. Ethan stood across the room, surrounded by his friends, his face glowing with joy and accomplishment. Seeing him so happy filled me with pride so overwhelming it almost hurt. But then my eyes landed on Daniel. He was holding court near the buffet table, like a politician on election night. His arm was slung casually around Ethan's shoulders as he spoke to a small crowd, his deep voice carrying over the music. Couldn't have done it without a lot of long nights and tough decisions. Daniel said, sighing dramatically. "But you do what you have to for your kid, right?" The crowd murmured their approval. "You're a good man, Daniel," someone said. "Ethan's lucky to have you," another added. I swallowed hard, tasting bitterness on my tongue. Lucky. That was a word I'd never associate with Daniel. I moved toward an empty chair in the corner, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped my purse. It was like watching a play where everyone had the script wrong. They saw Daniel as the selfless, hard-working father. They didn't see the missed birthdays, the empty promises, the nights Ethan had cried himself to sleep while I sat beside him, whispering comfort. I'd always stayed quiet for Ethan's sake, but hearing Daniel rewrite history so boldly made my chest tighten with anger. The dean approached the microphone at the center of the room and tapped it lightly, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we celebrate not just the graduates, but the families who stood beside them, lifting them up and cheering them on through this incredible journey." Applause filled the room. Daniel smiled broadly, as if the dean's words were meant for him alone. When the applause died down, Daniel cleared his throat. "If I could just say a few words," he said, already stepping forward without being invited. My stomach dropped. He launched into a speech that might have fooled anyone who didn't know better. "When Grace passed," he began solemnly, "I didn't know how I'd do it. Raising a boy on my own while working full-time wasn't easy. There were times I thought I'd fall apart, but Ethan was my anchor. Every late night at work, every sacrifice, I did it all for him." The crowd sighed sympathetically, several people dabbing at their eyes. I gripped my locket, my nails digging into my palm. He's lying to them, to all of them, and they believe him. He ended his speech with a flourish. "Today isn't just about Ethan's success. It's about perseverance, love, and family. We made it through together." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Daniel basked in it, beaming like a conquering hero, while Ethan stood quietly at his side, smiling politely but not saying much. I couldn't take it anymore. Now, when the crowd dispersed to refill their plates, I moved toward Daniel. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady when I said, "Daniel, may I speak with you for a moment? Alone." He glanced down at me, his smile slipping just a fraction. "Sure," he said warily, following me to a quiet corner near the exit. Once we were out of earshot, I turned to face him. "You shouldn't have said those things," I said softly but firmly. "You know they aren't true." Daniel's expression hardened. "I don't know what you mean," he said, feigning innocence. "You weren't there for Ethan," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "Not the way you've led everyone to believe. I was the one who stayed up with him when he was sick. I was the one who worked double shifts to pay his tuition. Don't you dare stand up there and take credit for sacrifices you never made." Daniel scoffed, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. "Margaret, people don't want to hear the messy details. They want a neat story. A boy who lost his mom, raised by a hard-working dad who never gave up. That's what they'll believe. Besides," he added with a smirk, "why does it matter? Ethan's doing great, isn't he?" His dismissiveness made my blood boil. "It matters because it's the truth," I said, my voice trembling now with emotion. "But you wouldn't understand that, and I won't ruin Ethan's day by calling you out in front of everyone." Daniel shrugged, utterly unbothered. "Good, because honestly, Margaret, no one cares about the sacrifices of some old woman. Let me have my moment." I stared at him, stunned by his audacity. Then I drew in a slow breath, straightened my spine, and met his gaze with quiet defiance. "You can have the crowd, Daniel," I said calmly, "but Ethan knows the truth. That's all that matters to me." His smirk faltered, just for a second. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding but my dignity intact. Across the room, Ethan caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me it was everything. In that smile, I saw my validation, my proof that love and truth didn't need an audience to be real. And for the first time all day, I felt at peace. By the time the crowd began thinning out, the reception hall felt quieter, though the faint buzz of celebration still lingered in the air. Families were gathering their things, snapping a few last photos, and heading toward the parking lot. I sat alone on a bench just outside the building, needing a moment to breathe. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of spring flowers and cut grass. The chatter and laughter inside had been overwhelming, and my heart was still pounding from my confrontation with Daniel. I hadn't wanted to ruin Ethan's day, but keeping my emotions contained had been exhausting. I rubbed the silver locket between my fingers, whispering to Grace, as I often did when life felt too heavy. He's everything you hoped he would be, baby girl. Strong, kind, brilliant. I just wish you could see him today. The click of the door opening pulled me back to the present. Grandma? I looked up to see Ethan standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden light spilling from the reception hall. He was still in his cap and gown, though his tie was loosened and his cap hung loosely from one hand. "There you are," he said with a soft smile. "I've been looking all over for you." I wiped quickly at my eyes, trying to hide any trace of tears. "I just needed a little fresh air," I said, patting the space beside me. "Come sit." He sat down, his long legs stretching out in front of him like they had when he was a gangly teenager. For a moment, we just sat in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the night surrounding us. Then Ethan turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "Grandma, I wanted to talk to you privately. There's something I need you to know." My heart gave a nervous flutter. "What is it, sweetheart?" He exhaled slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. "That essay I wrote," he began, his voice low, "the one that got me the scholarship. It was about you." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "The dean. He told me," I whispered. Ethan's eyes softened. "Good. Because I wanted you to hear it from me too. I know everyone thinks Dad did all the work to get me here, but you and I both know that's not true. You were the one who raised me. You were the one who sacrificed everything." His words cracked something inside me, a dam of emotions I'd been holding back for years. "Oh, Ethan." My voice trembled. "I didn't do it for recognition. I just wanted you to have a good life." "I know," he said quickly, his hand covering mine. "And that's exactly why I had to write about you. Grandma, I've always seen what you've done for me. Even when I was a little kid, I noticed how tired you were after work, how you'd still stay up late to help me with homework. I noticed how you never missed a single soccer game, even when you were sick. I saw it all." Tears blurred my vision, and I couldn't hold them back any longer. They spilled freely down my cheeks as Ethan continued. "You're the reason I made it through school," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me what it means to work hard, to care about people, to never give up. Everything I am, it's because of you." I let out a soft sob, my free hand clutching the locket at my throat. "I always wondered if you knew," I whispered. "If you understood how much I loved you, how hard I tried to give you a good life." Ethan pulled me into a hug so tight it stole my breath. "I know, Grandma," he said fiercely. "I've always known." We stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other, the night air wrapping around us like a blanket. When we finally pulled apart, Ethan wiped at his own tears with the back of his hand and gave me a small, determined smile. "I didn't tell anyone else about the essay," he admitted. "I didn't want to embarrass Dad or cause drama today, but I needed you to know that you are my hero. No matter what anyone says, you're the one who made this possible." My heart ached at his words, but it was a good ache, a healing one. "You've already given me more than I could ever ask for," I said softly. "Your love, your gratitude, that's all I need." Ethan nodded, his hand squeezing mine. "And you'll always have it. Always." For the first time in years, I felt completely seen, completely understood. No speech, no applause, no public recognition could ever match this moment between us. Because this was real. This was ours. The ride home from the reception felt strangely quiet, as though the whole world was holding its breath. Ethan was riding with friends to celebrate, and Daniel had left earlier with a few relatives who were eager to continue bragging about his son's big day. I drove alone down the winding country road toward home, the headlights casting long beams across the dark pavement. The night should have been perfect, Ethan had graduated with honors, received a scholarship, and was starting a new chapter in his life. But beneath the pride swelling in my chest, there was still an ache I couldn't quite name, a knot of conflicting emotions I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to scream the truth for the whole world to hear. I wanted to stand up at that reception, point straight at Daniel and say, "He didn't raise Ethan. He didn't make the sacrifices. I did. Me. The grandmother you all ignore." I imagined the shock on their faces, the awkward silence that would follow, and the vindication I might feel if they finally saw me for who I truly was. But then, I imagined Ethan's face. I saw the hurt in his eyes as his special day was overshadowed by a public fight. I saw the delicate balance of peace he had tried so hard to maintain shatter like glass. And I knew the truth didn't need an audience. It already lived between us. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light cast a soft glow over the front steps. I sat in the car for a long moment before turning off the engine, listening to the quiet hum as it faded. Inside, the house felt warm and familiar, filled with the echoes of years spent raising Ethan. There was the worn couch where we'd watched cartoons when he was little, the scuffed kitchen table where he'd done his homework while I cooked dinner. The wall near the staircase still bore faint pencil marks from when I'd measured his height each year on his birthday. Every corner of this house was a testament to our journey, and none of it required anyone else's. Validation. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the living room, settling into my favorite armchair. My body felt heavy, drained from the day's emotions, but my mind was alive with thoughts. Daniel's smug face flashed through my memory, his false speech, his calculated lies. My fingers tightened around the mug. Letting him continue his charade felt wrong, yet confronting him publicly would only hurt Ethan. It wasn't fair, but life rarely is. I closed my eyes and pictured Ethan's smile when he told me about the essay, his voice steady and sincere as he'd said, "You're the reason I am who I am." That was the truth that mattered. That was my victory. The next day, friends and neighbors called to congratulate me on Daniel's fine parenting. "Ethan's lucky to have a dad like that," one neighbor said cheerfully over the phone. I simply smiled and replied, "Yes, he's very lucky." When I hung up, I stared at the receiver for a long time, feeling both hollow and strangely free. I didn't need to correct them. I didn't need to defend myself or rewrite their stories, because Ethan knew. He had always known. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender. The world around me was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a car on the highway. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, the pain of being overlooked, dismissed, erased. Tonight, I let that weight go. Daniel could have the spotlight. Let him tell his stories and bask in his hollow praise. I had something far more precious, Ethan's love and gratitude, freely given and deeply felt. Some truths are too sacred to be shouted. They're meant to be held close, like a locket worn near the heart. And so I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is choosing peace over pride. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual, stirred by a strange mix of restlessness and calm. A soft gray light filtered through the curtains, signaling the first signs of dawn. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house settling and the distant chirping of birds. It felt like any other morning, yet somehow it wasn't. Yesterday had changed everything, not in a loud, earth-shattering way, but in a quiet, irreversible shift, like the turning of a tide. Ethan's words, his love, still echoed in my heart, filling the spaces that had once been hollow with validation I never thought I'd receive. I slipped out of bed and padded softly into the kitchen, where the coffee pot waited. As the machine gurgled to life, filling the room with the rich, comforting scent of brewing coffee, I glanced at the small stack of photographs on the counter. They were from the graduation, Ethan in his cap and gown, smiling with his friends, Daniel posing proudly. Beside him, arms wide like he'd single-handedly built the young man Ethan had become. I picked up one photo and studied it carefully. Daniel's face radiated triumph, but Ethan's expression told a different story. There was a subtle softness in his eyes, a glance directed slightly off camera, toward me. My throat tightened. That tiny look said more than words ever could. I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it out to the porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and blooming wildflowers. From my porch, I could see the fields stretching out for miles, bathed in a pale, silvery light. It reminded me of the mornings when Ethan was little, and we'd sit out here together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise before he left for school. Back then, life had been hard. So hard, I'd wondered some nights if I'd make it to the next day. But we had. We'd made it. I cradled my coffee mug and thought of Grace. "Your boy did it," I whispered into the stillness, my voice trembling, and he turned out to be everything you hoped for. For a moment, I imagined her sitting beside me, her hand warm against mine, her eyes bright with pride. I liked to think she'd be grateful, not just for Ethan's success, but for the love that had carried him here. A single tear slipped down my cheek, but it wasn't from sorrow. It was from a deep, quiet joy. Later, my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, stopped by to bring me a plate of muffins. "You must be so proud of Ethan," she said warmly. "And Daniel, too. It's wonderful seeing a father so devoted to his son." I smiled gently and nodded. "Yes," I said simply. "It really is." There was no bitterness in my voice this time, no urge to correct her. The truth lived safely between Ethan and me, and that was enough. As the sun began to rise fully, streaks of gold and pink painted the sky. The light spilled across the porch, illuminating the locket around my neck. I held it in my hand, rubbing my thumb over its smooth surface. Inside was the tiny photograph of Grace holding baby Ethan, the beginning of it all. "So much has happened since then," I murmured, "but we're still standing." Across town, Daniel was probably already telling another version of the story, spinning lies to anyone who would listen. But that no longer mattered to me. He could keep his illusion, his applause, his fleeting glory. Because while his praise would fade with time, what Ethan and I shared was unshakable and eternal. Ethan knew the truth. I knew the truth. And Grace, wherever she was, surely knew it too. That was all I needed. As the sun climbed higher, I took a deep breath of the cool morning air. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a serenity I hadn't felt in years. Life hadn't been fair, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every tear, every sleepless night, every sacrifice. Because love, the quiet, unseen kind, had won in the end. I stood, lifting my face to the warmth of the sun, and whispered softly into the breeze, "You were never invisible, Margaret. You mattered. You still matter." Then I walked back into the house, ready to begin a new day, knowing that even without recognition or applause, my story had already been written in the heart of the person who mattered most.